Just over 7 months after its E3 announcement, Resident Evil 2 has now been released in a new and remade form. This might not be exactly what some were expecting though, as this is actually a much more thorough remake than any game in this series has ever received before, but has this overhaul improved on a classic, or has it spoiled what made the original such a success? Before we really begin, I feel like I need to clarify a few things and make a bit of a confession. I've never really been the biggest fan of Resident Evil. Oh, it seems like a decent enough series and all, but for whatever reason, I was just never that interested in these games. As a matter of fact, I never even played any of the original trilogy. Don't get me wrong, I am familiar with the series and I have played various demos and portions of some games here and there, but no, I haven't actually played the original Resident Evil 2 before. I do have a fairly strong idea of what it was all about though, but if you feel I should have first-hand experience of the original to talk about this remake, then this video won't be for you. For those of you who decide to hear me out though, I guess we can start by taking a look at the story. I'm fairly certain it's pretty much the same as in the original, and if you're at all familiar with the franchise, you should at least know the basic gist already, but let's just give it a quick once-over nonetheless. As with the original, you actually get two characters to play as, either Leon Kennedy or Claire Redfield. While the core elements of both campaigns are pretty much the same though, there are still enough differences to make them stand apart as well. In fact, there are several reasons to play through both storylines at least once, but we'll get to that. The stories themselves aren't really anything all that revolutionary though. In essence, Leon and Claire have to find their way out of a zombie-infested raccoon city after having travelled there to, in Leon's case, work as a police officer, and in Claire's case, find her brother. At least, that's the initial idea, but things quickly get a tad more complicated than that. For example, Leon eventually runs into a woman named Ada claiming to be an FBI agent investigating the outbreak. As Leon wants to bring those responsible to justice as well, the two of them eventually team up in an effort to put a stop to the outbreak and take down the culprits, the Umbrella Corporation. As for Claire, she quickly discovers that her brother, Chris, has apparently gone on vacation, but as she's making her way to safety, she runs into a young girl named Sherry. After saving her from a mutated monstrosity, Claire agrees to help Sherry find her mother, who apparently works for Umbrella. Now there is quite a bit more to discover as well, but that is at least the basic gist. Like I said though, there's nothing all that mind-blowing about any of this, but it's more than acceptable, especially if you take into account when the original game came out. It's certainly more than enough to hold your attention and push you forward, unless you're just too afraid to move, that is. You see, as this is a horror game, it kinda goes without saying that it might get a tad scary at times. Sure, there have been plenty of so-called horror games that couldn't even scare a fly, but I'm happy to say that this is not one of them. Fair enough, it does rely a bit too much on jump scares in my opinion, but that's certainly not its only way of putting the shakes in your boots. For starters, there's the visual style and presentation. While the original game featured fixed camera angles that changed depending on your location, this version opts for an over-the-shoulder view instead. This doesn't give you quite as much of an overview of your surroundings, but I do feel it ultimately works for the better, especially considering the stunning graphical fidelity. Yeah, this game's visuals are truly something to behold. Fair enough, the facial animations do occasionally dip a bit into the uncanny valley, and I personally think it could stand to be a tad less dark at times, but these graphics are still seriously impressive. They also make the various settings and creatures seem even creepier, only adding to the overall atmosphere and tone of the game. As good as the game looks though, it might sound even better. The various gurgles, hisses and roars from the undead hordes perfectly matches the accompanying creatures, and hearing their moans in the distance can definitely make you reconsider your current path. Most of the ambient noises are also extremely well utilized, but one sound in particular will tense you up more than anything else. You see, the primary threats here are rather obviously the zombies, but they're not necessarily the most frightening things ever. Or they're still pretty intimidating, as not only are their movements and appearances fairly unsettling, but they're also extremely resilient and persistent. Even if you knock them down, they will usually get back up at least once, so they're certainly not pushovers. They're not the only enemy type though, and compared to the other creatures you have to face, they're not nearly as scary. Okay, so maybe the zombie dogs aren't that much worse, but the so-called lickers certainly are. Not only do these things look much creepier, but they make a much more distinct and spine-chilling sound, and they are far fiercer and more difficult to deal with. Even the lickers aren't really the worst enemy though, as they can still be taken down. Hell, as they operate by sound and not sight, you can even just sneak past them, but there is one foe you simply can't defeat. No really, this guy is literally unbeatable, so when you see or hear him coming, all you can really do is run. I am of course talking about the creature known as the Tyrant or Mr. X. While this big brute may not be the creepiest looking villain ever, as he's basically just a giant in a trench coat, he's still pretty damn scary. Even the noise he makes is terrifying, and yes, that is the sound I was referring to earlier, the sound of his massive lumbering footsteps. Honestly, the Tyrant is a masterpiece of horror. Having this unstoppable killing machine relentlessly tracking you down is genuinely nerve-wracking, and even when you're temporarily safe, just hearing him stomping around can be enough to make you freeze in place. Unfortunately, this doesn't really last, as this all turns out to be a bit of a con job. Again, I do think the Tyrant is a great horror villain, and I was legitimately scared by him, but the more I played the game, the more I realized that he's actually much easier to deal with than you're led to believe. No, there's no trick that allows you to kill him or anything, but you don't really need to keep as much of a distance from him as you might think. The thing is that if you plan ahead properly, you don't really need to worry about the Tyrant. Just run your ass off between your objectives whenever he shows up, and you'll probably get rid of him quicker than if you're careful and try to avoid him. Hell, even if he finds you, he more than likely won't be able to kill you until you get by him, all of which makes him slightly less intimidating. Now, I will say that this mostly pertains to any secondary playthroughs, as you're not as likely to know when the Tyrant pops up and where and what you need to do next the first time around. You might have a bit of a clue if you've played the original, but from what I understand and considering the new viewpoint and all, you'll probably not be certain until at least your second run. What is certain is that who you play as also has quite an effect on, among other things, your interactions with the Tyrant. Sure, both stories are very similar as they contain most of the same elements and set pieces, but there are quite a few differences as well. For one thing, each character has their own weaponry, and for another, they don't have all the same experiences. For example, the Tyrant is nearly as much of a threat in Claire's storyline. Not to spoil anything here, but she really only runs into him once, whereas Leon actually has 4 encounters with him. This definitely makes Leon's campaign a bit more tense and slightly trickier, but I personally think Claire's playthrough is much more enjoyable. Now, this might be partially down to the fact that I played as Leon first, meaning I was a bit more familiar with the game once I started playing as Claire, but that's certainly not the full reason. I just think her campaign is slightly more interesting and has a teeny bit more variety, not to mention the fact that her weaponry is far better than Leon's, at least in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, Leon's campaign is by no means bad, I just found it a bit more frustrating. Or both campaigns can get quite challenging, but at least with Claire it felt like things got progressively harder, whereas things actually got easier towards the end with Leon. Maybe that was just me, but yeah, it just felt like Claire had a more natural difficulty curve. Both campaigns were good enough for me to play through them twice though. You see, completing a campaign opens up a so-called second run option, and I have to say, these disappointed me quite a bit. I mean, you're kinda led to believe that this will let you play through the events either character went through during the other's first run, but that's not what we end up getting after all. Sure, the second runs do have alternate starting points and a few items and puzzles have been changed slightly, but other than that, we get the exact same thing as in the first runs. Okay, so you do get an extra true ending as well, but this still feels like a wasted effort, especially since from what I understand, the extra scenarios in the original game were vastly different experiences. This certainly isn't helped by the fact that the puzzles don't really change between playthroughs either. Don't get me wrong, they're enjoyable enough, and they do, as mentioned, change a few of them a teeny bit for the second runs, but after the first attempt, they're still more of a formality than anything else. Again, they're not bad, but it wouldn't have hurt to change them up a bit more. Another thing they possibly could have altered further is the inventory system. No, it's not horrible or anything, and it does technically add another level of strategy to the game, but it's still a bit cumbersome and annoying. Maybe it wouldn't really have worked if the inventory was less restrictive, but I'm fairly certain they could have done something a bit better. In essence, you can only carry a limited amount of items at a time, and everything you find takes up at least one slot of your inventory. While you can and will gain more spaces as you progress though, and you are able to store excess items in the storage boxes found throughout the game, you'll still have to manage your inventory rather carefully, leading to a lot of fiddling around and backtracking. At least finding your way around is pretty hassle-free though, thanks to the new map system. Not only does this show you the layout of the various locations, it also highlights save points, storage boxes and other various key elements, not to mention any and all items you've come across but not yet picked up. It even color codes the rooms to help you even further. That's right, if you ever wonder where to go or if you've missed something, you only need to consult the map. If a room still contains some secret or hidden item, it will be shown in red, making it very easy to track down equipment, clues and ammo. Sure, it might take some of the fun out of just discovering things for yourself, but in my opinion it just makes things more convenient. All things considered, this is an excellent game and one hell of a remake. Sure, they could have made even more improvements, but this is still a great example of what you're supposed to do with a remake. Take what made the original good, smooth out or remove some of the rougher parts, and add modernized improvements where possible. Now, I'm not going to say that this is definitely better than the original, certainly not in every way, but even someone like me who just has a cursory knowledge of that game should be able to tell that this at least gives it a run for its money. As a matter of fact, it's made me way more interested in this franchise than I ever have been before, so in that sense especially, it's a massive step up. As mentioned though, there are still a few trouble spots, and the way the second scenarios have been more or less butchered is a huge letdown, but the good really does more than outweigh the bad here. If you're a fan of horror games, this franchise or both, you need to give this one a go, as I fear we won't see anything else like it until another Resident Evil gets the same treatment. Here's hoping.